Leslie Jamison is one of the most honest and innovative writers at work today. In her novel, The Gin Closet, and her acclaimed essay collection, The Empathy Exams, she asks unsparing questions about what it is to be human and the fine line between what is experienced and what is true. Her new book, The Recovering, Intoxication and Its Aftermath, is an astonishing document. In it, she interweaves her path to her own sobriety with the stories of well-known writers, as well as her fellow travelers. She stares straight into the mess of her own journey, the gendered and failed ways we talk about recovery, and our evolving understanding of the sources of creativity. Jamie Quatro's work, both in her collection of stories, I Want to Show You More, and her wonderful new novel, Fire Sermon, intersects with Leslie's in many themes and obsessions, which we will talk about tonight. And also, most importantly, they both constantly wrestle with form, going deeper and refusing narrative structures that are no longer enough to contain their fierce truths. As I said, Beyonce and Rihanna. Makes so much sense. Please help me welcome Leslie Jamison and Jamie Quatro to Politics and Prose.
Thank you, Liz, for that introduction. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you all for coming. It's really, really an honor to be reading here. Washington, D.C. is the city where I was born, and this bookstore is a place where I spent a lot of time. I came back to visit my aunt for many years, so this space means a lot to me, and yeah, it's incredible to be here and incredible to be here with you. I'm really excited to talk to Jamie tonight. I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the beginning of the book, and then we'll chat for a bit, and then we'll chat with all of you. The first time I ever felt it, the buzz, I was almost 13. I didn't vomit or black out or even embarrass myself. I just loved it. I loved the crackle of champagne, its hot pine needles down my throat. We were celebrating my brother's college graduation, and I wore a long muslin dress that made me feel like a child until I felt something else. Initiated. A glow. The whole world stood accused. You never told me it felt this good. The first time I ever drank in secret, I was 15. My mom was out of town. My friends and I spread a blanket across living room hardwood and drank whatever we could find in the fridge, Chardonnay wedged between the orange juice and the mayonnaise. We were giddy from a sense of trespass. The first time I ever got high, I was smoking pot on a stranger's couch, my fingers dripping pool water as I dampened the joint with my grip. A friend of a friend had invited me to a swimming party. My hair smelled like chlorine and my body quivered against my damp bikini. Strange little animals blossomed through my elbows and shoulders where the parts of me bent and connected. I thought, what is this? And how can it keep being this? With a good feeling, it was always more, again, forever. The first time I ever drank with a boy, I let him put his hands under my shirt on the wooden balcony of a lifeguard station. Dark waves shushed the sand below our dangling feet. My first boyfriend. He liked to get high. He liked to get his cat high. We used to make out in his mother's minivan. He came to a family meal at my house fully wired on speed. So talkative, said my grandma, deeply smitten. At Disneyland, he broke open a baggie of withered mushroom caps and started breathing fast and shallow in line for Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, sweating through his shirt, pawing at the orange rocks of the fake frontier. If I had to say where my drinking began, which first time began it, I might say it started with my first blackout, or maybe the first time I sought blackout, the first time I wanted nothing more than to be absent from my own life. Maybe it started the first time I threw up from drinking, the first time I dreamed about drinking, the first time I lied about drinking, the first time I dreamed about lying about drinking, when the craving had gotten so deep there wasn't much of me that wasn't committed to either serving or fighting it. Maybe my drinking began with patterns rather than moments once I started drinking every day, which happened in Iowa City, where the drinking didn't seem dramatic and pronounced so much as encompassing and inevitable. There were so many ways and places to get drunk. The fiction bar in a smoky double-wide trailer with a stuffed fox head and a bunch of broken clocks, or the poetry bar down the street with its anemic cheeseburgers and glowing Schlitz ad, a scrolling electric landscape, the gurgling stream, the neon grassy banks, the flickering waterfall. I mashed the lime in my vodka tonic and glimpsed, in the sweet spot between 2 drinks and 3, then 3 and 4, then 4 and 5, my life as something illuminated from the inside. There were parties at a place called the Farmhouse out in the cornfields, past Friday fish fries at the American Legion. These were parties where poets wrestled in a kiddie pool full of jello, and everyone's profile looked beautiful in the crackling light of a mattress bonfire. Winters were cold enough to kill you. There were endless potlucks where older writers brought braised meats and younger writers brought plastic tubs of hummus, and everyone brought whiskey, and everyone brought wine. Winter kept going. We kept drinking. Then it was spring. We kept drinking then, too. Sitting on a folding chair in a church basement, you always face the question of how to begin. It has always been a hazard for me to speak at an AA meeting. A man named Charlie told a Cleveland AA meeting in 1959. Because I knew that I could do better than other people. I really had a story to tell. I was more articulate. I could dramatize it, and I would really knock them dead. He explained the hazard like this. He'd gotten praised. He'd gotten proud. He'd gotten drunk. Now he was talking to a big crowd about how dangerous it was for him to talk to a big crowd. He was describing the perils of an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. He was being articulate about being articulate. He was dramatizing what the art of dramatizing had done to him. He said, "I think I got tired of being my own hero." 15 years earlier, he'd published a best-selling novel about alcoholism while sober, but he relapsed a few years after it became a bestseller. "I've written a book that's been called The Definitive Portrait of the Alcoholic," he told the group, "and it did me no good." It was only after 5 minutes of talking that Charlie finally thought to begin the way others began. "My name is Charles Jackson," he said, "and I am an alcoholic." By coming back to the common refrain, he was reminding himself that commonality could be its own saving grace. "My story isn't much different from anyone's," he said. "It's the story of a man who was made a fool of by alcohol over and over and over, year after year after year, until finally the day came when I learned that I could not handle this alone." Thanks. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for that reading. Such an amazing book. And congratulations to you on all the amazing reviews and praise. And it's just, you are in for a treat if you haven't already read this book. It's phenomenal. Thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting us. I was here just a couple months ago. It was pouring rain. This is such a more beautiful time of year to be back. So it's a beautiful city. Thanks for hosting me. Leslie, I wanted to open with a beautiful poem fragment that I happened to be getting your book out the other day and kind of rereading it. And it just happened to fall open to this poem fragment. I just wanted to read it and then talk to you about it. It says, it's a fragment from John Berryman, and it says, "Take up outside your blocked selves some small thing that is moving, and wants to keep on moving and needs, therefore, Tyson Joe, you're loving. And he was writing to Tyson and Joe. But the small thing that's moving and that needs to keep on moving made me think of your baby and the situation you're in right now. And I just wanted to ask you, how's that going with having a book and a baby out at the same time?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you read that fragment, because it moves me every time I hear it. John Berryman was writing that poem to Tyson and Joe, who were two of the people that he had been in a detox ward with recently. And, when he talked to them about picking some small thing outside of themselves that might need their loving, he was also, I think, talking to himself and what he felt like he needed to do in order to stay sober. And I also just want to say thank you for being here. It felt like such grace that Jamie and I got to put books out into the world at a similar time, both that we could kind of process that experience and we read each other's books at the same time when we're writing to each other about them, and her novel is truly incredible. And we were also sort of remarking on the fact that, Jamie, you've been watching you're on the precipice of your fourth kid going to college, and I'm kind of at the beginning of the journey, and so we're thinking about the creative life and parenting from sort of different.
Yeah, my book tour looks very different from hers. Someone asked me tonight, "What are your kids doing?" I was like, "I don't even think they know I've left." They have no idea.
I mean, it's an incredible thing. I mean, I guess I've been working on the book for about 8 years, and in a way, I feel like my whole life up to this point has been training to try to keep my daughter alive and figure out how to kind of usher another creature into the world, like physically and spiritually and emotionally. And I have to say, in a way, it feels really appropriate to me to have the book come into the world and to have my daughter come into the world at a similar time, because I feel like the book, among other things, is a kind of transcription of my journey towards becoming the kind of person, or the best version of myself that I could be to imagine parenting her. And the book is a lot more than that, as some of the descriptions have suggested. It's my story, but it's my story in conversation with a number of other stories. So stories of writers and artists who got sober or tried to get sober, an examination of what kinds of creativity came from their sobriety. But it's also my story in conversation with the stories of people in recovery who aren't famous, who aren't professional storytellers. And it's kind of all of those individual lives in conversation with a larger story about how America has thought about addiction in really paradoxical ways in the past 100 years. So it's in that kind of outward motion. It's also, enacting part of what felt very powerful to me about recovery, which is this kind of opening outwards to look at other lives.
Yeah, it's called an addiction memoir, but it's actually also journalism, social criticism, literary criticism, cultural history. And there's this conception with a typical addiction memoir, like, oh, just another addiction memoir. In fact, you say in the book, she says she Googled just another addiction memoir, and you have so many people kind of giving this disclaimer. Well, it's not just another addiction memoir. But you write in the book that, you kind of address this head on, that you say the accusation of sameness gets turned on its head by recovery. Your story is only useful because others have lived it and will live it again. I think it's an incredibly compassionate move to write an addiction memoir that is so focused on the recovery part of addiction and not on the sort of train wreck stories. Not just because of addicts, that's what you need is to hear the same stories over and over, but also as a family member of an addict and having gone through rehab and Al-Anon and all of these things, as for family members of addicts, to hear those stories of recovering, that was what I clung to, and I think a lot of us cling to is, yes, it's hard not to listen to the addiction stories, but the recovering is so important. And I feel like your book is it's a new thing in that sense. It's incredibly compassionate, but also, as writers, we're told, make it original. Don't make it the same. So did you struggle with that tension between, yes, I want to write, acknowledge sameness as healing, and yet I need to make something original out of that? How did you navigate that tension?
Yeah, so much. I mean, it was interesting, that Google search that you were mentioning, that came from this sense that I had sort of heard in the ether over and over again, this phrase, just another addiction memoir, usually in the context of denying, like, oh, that my book isn't just another addiction memoir, or a blurb saying this book isn't just another addiction memoir. And I feel like that phrase held a lot of deeper significance because it suggested this taboo surrounding the idea of telling a story that's already been told, and how that taboo attaches in a particularly fierce way to the story of addiction. This idea that we've already heard that story and that there's something gratuitous or self-indulgent about telling it again. But one of the questions that I was really drawn to exploring in the book came out of my own participation in two different storytelling communities that seemed to me to have almost opposite ethoses, right? So it's like, in these literary environments where I'd spent a lot of time, that the imperative was always do something original. The modernists said make it new, and it felt like we were all living in their shadow. And in the communities of recovery, a story was, as you said, like, useful insofar as it was not new, and that was not damning. Yeah. It was something kind of incredibly exciting and incredibly useful, that idea of a story being useful rather than beautiful. And so I wanted to really look at kind of both what happened to people who tried to move, who were citizens of both of those worlds and tried to move between them. So looking at authors who were in recovery and kind of how that, both what they brought to the kinds of storytelling that happened in recovery and what they took back from recovery to their own storytelling practice. Like, what did it mean to be a traveler between those two spaces? Mm-hmm. And then I really believe that stories are both unoriginal and always original, that like every story that's already been told gets kind of reborn inside the particularity of every life in which it's lived again. And so in that sense, I believe that something is both a story we've already heard and always something we're hearing for the first time.
Speaking of those other people's stories, you write a lot about sort of the great drunk male authors, specifically the ones you were at Iowa with. So John Cheever, Carver, Behrman. And you talk about how there's this sort of mythos of the tortured genius male alcoholic artist, and how there's almost an ethos around them there that garners sort of, we need to respect that artistic impulse to get drunk. But then you talk about female artists like Jean Rhys and Billie Holiday, who in their alcoholism are characterized as abandoners of family. And, they're not taking care of their children. Why do you think that there has been this disparity between this gender disparity between the ways male drunkenness and female drunkenness, or male addiction and female addiction are treated?
Yeah, well, I mean, without kind of reducing anything, I think that, socially we bring so many expectations to women that they will be caregivers, whether that's expectations around the kinds of mothers that women are supposed to be, or even if women are not mothers, this idea that that part of their role in all kinds of relationships is to be a giver of care. And so often kind of given that baseline understanding that's often brought to women, I think that when women's addictions are perceived, one of the lenses through which they're seen is that you are kind of retreating into the self-indulgence of your addiction and kind of neglecting somebody else. And I think that there's just a much more kind of well-trodden space to understand the kind of debauched, reckless, kind of charismatically self-destructive man, and that women are more likely to be seen as negligent or else kind of melodramatic or histrionic, or I kept noticing that, and both Jean Rhys and Billie Holiday definitely, I think, were seen through those kinds of lenses. So even, I mean, Jean Rhys was legitimately a bit of a difficult character. I'm not sure that I say at one point in the book, I'm not sure I would want to spend a weekend with Jean Rhys. Not that she would have wanted to necessarily spend a weekend with me, but that she was called by her first biographer one of the great self-pity artists of the 20th century. Her addiction was really bound up in this archetype of the self-destructive woman as also kind of like wallowing in self-pity and kind of enamored of her own despair. And Billie Holiday was she was certainly seen as a kind of tortured artist and somebody whose kind of beauty rose up through and sort of effused through her pain. But she was also, Billie Holiday actually deeply wanted to be a mother, and over and over again was sort of seen as unfit to be a mother, was judged that way by a judge when she was trying to adopt a child, was seen that way by other people in her life. And so that idea of the kind of the addict female as a negligent mother. I also think about that idea a little bit in relation to the media construction of crack mothers in the late 80s and how they were sort of seen as socially deviant because they were failing at motherhood.
Yeah, I was going to get into actually the ways that we polarize addiction based on socioeconomic status and race as well. You write, America has never been able to decide whether addicts are victims or criminals, whether addiction is an illness or a crime. White addicts get their suffering witnessed. Addicts of color get punished. But then you go on to admit your own position of privilege, which you say, I'm precisely the kind of nice upper middle class white girl whose relationship to substances has been treated as benign or pitiable, a cause for concern, or a shrug rather than punishment. Do you think is it a uniquely American tendency to want to cast everything in this sort of black and white, good and evil, rich and poor, male and female? Is the tide turning? Do you want to talk a little bit about the cultural history behind that with Anslinger? Just speak to that a little.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it's uniquely American, but it certainly participates in like the great American tradition of systemic racism and feels like kind of one of many theaters in which that has played out. And part of the book is tracking the ways in which Harry Anslinger, who was one of the kind of the godfather of the American war on drugs, but the way in which in the 1930s, as he was developing and actually trying to kind of drum up funding for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he was doing a lot of powerful storytelling. And that's really why it felt to me like that story about policy also belonged in this book, because it was a story about storytelling. So I'm looking at sort of how storytelling works in the literary sphere. I'm looking at how storytelling works in a recovery sphere, but I also wanted to look at, okay, how does storytelling about addiction work in the policy sphere as well? And Harry Anslinger, in order to generate public support for these increasingly punitive approaches to drugs and addiction in America, told a ton of stories about addicts and what they did. You know, he was telling crazy stories about marijuana addicts, raping old women while under the influence. And I mean, that's not my own personal experience of what smoking pot is like, so I mean, it's like the ways in which he was telling those stories also had everything to do with race and scapegoating minority communities. And you can kind of track the history of American perception on drugs in terms of marginalized communities that have been scapegoated in relation to opium, in relation to cocaine and blacks in the South in the early 20th century, in relation to Hispanic immigrants and marijuana in the 30s, in relation to inner city African American communities in the crack wars, obviously, in relation to rural white communities and meth. It's over and over again. It's these communities getting kind of targeted as villains, and meanwhile there are other spheres in which addiction is seen as something that you need to be helped to recover from, rather than in a sense kind of held accountable for. And that disconnect was it felt like it had everything to do with like, what is the narrative that we're trying to put this experience inside of?
And do you propose, or do you have thoughts about how that narrative can be corrected, or how we can begin to move beyond that polarization?
Yeah, I mean, I what I would love to see is a kind of a broadly more compassionate story being told about addiction kind of across the board. So I guess I would toss out like the villain side of the equation, which isn't to disregard kind of personal accountability, but is to say that if the same kind of compassion and this idea that like treatment is also just simply going to be more effective than punitive strategies. There's this great book called The Unbroken Brain by a woman named Maya Salovich, and she proposes sort of thinking about addiction as in the framework of a learning disorder, where one of its signature traits is a kind of immunity to negative consequences. So you keep doing this thing despite all the bad things that happen to you. And so in a sense, if you're looking at it through that framework, nothing could be more ineffective than a punitive approach to addiction, right? If the very thing that defines it is that it's not responsive to negative consequences. Right. And that was a really, her way of framing that felt like a very succinct, helpful way of calling for the kind of policy changes that seem important to me. Yeah.
We talk about AA a little bit in the AA model of recovery. So was there a struggle in writing about an organization that kind of has as its foundational tenet anonymity? And then you were kind of interviewing all of these subjects, and specifically some just regular addicts. I know you wanted to include with the Seneca House residents. Did you struggle? How did you navigate writing about something that actually has anonymity as its foundational?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I think to me I did think about it a lot, and there are kind of two parts of that answer to me. And one has to do with my own anonymity, and the other part has to do with everybody else's anonymity. And so in thinking about the decision to kind of break my own anonymity in that way, it really came from my own experience as a reader of other narratives. So books like Carolyn Knapp's Drinking, A Love Story, Mary Carr's Lit, where, they took different approaches to the question of anonymity, but where it was incredibly important to me as a reader. I read both of those books when I was still drinking, but both of them kind of planted the seeds of the sobriety that was to come. It was really important to me to read not just stories of addiction, but stories of recovery, and important to me to kind of read narratives from people who had been in 12-step recovery, and to see what that had been like. And if so, in a way, without the breaking of anonymity, Carolyn Knapp couldn't have given me that story that I needed to read and needed to hear. So that was part of what felt important. I think it's a deeply personal decision, but that was really where the motivation came from for me, was knowing what it had meant to me to read stories in the past. And then but it felt like a completely different thing to think about. I would never want to write a book that violated anyone else's anonymity. Mm-hmm. So that both meant that anybody that I met through recovery, not very many of those stories are in the book, but in the case where I do narrate my relationship with somebody else in recovery, I changed all of their information, and I also gave those portions of the book to everybody who was featured in them, and asked for their feedback. And then the stories that do feature more prominently, it felt very important to me that those all be people that I encounter as a writer, and explicitly ask them, can I include your stories in this book? I wanted that contract to be very transparent. It felt important to kind of engage in that in a non-exploitative way. So those more extended stories are ones where it's people who were in recovery, but people that I encountered as a journalist, and their anonymity is also preserved by the way in which they're written about in the text. So yeah,
well, you did a beautiful job. I don't know how many of you have seen the New Yorker profile. There's an incredible profile in the current New Yorker by Gary Greenberg, and he writes about the tyranny of the AA model of recovery, and as you call it, the tyranny of abstinence. He writes, "It may be instructive that the cure for addiction is to trade in one tyrant for another." And I had to pause when I read that. Like, I understand the point he's making, that there's this like blind obedience required to abstinence, the way that kind of your substance requires of you, that kind of obedience. But do you think there's a qualitative difference between the two kinds of tyranny, the tyranny of abstinence and the tyranny of addiction?
Yeah, and I think he and I might have even been talking about tyranny in slightly different ways. I loved his response to the book. I thought it was really smart and perceptive and expansive and provocative. I think when I use that phrase tyranny of abstinence, it was less to describe abstinence itself as like intrinsically tyrannical, and more to say that I think abstinence, there's a danger in thinking of abstinence as the only model of what healing can look like. I think abstinence is what some people need, but I also think that thinking too exclusively about abstinence can obstruct really necessary forms of social change. I think like harm reduction or kinds of programs that bring people into better health, but might not necessarily result in abstinence. And again, to me, it comes back to how can we have a variety of stories that we tell about addiction? How can we have a variety of stories we tell about recovery? And in some of those stories, recovery might look like abstinence. And in other stories, recovery might just look like getting into a better space and getting into better health and maybe kind of opening the door for a better life. So it felt important to me, especially because I was writing a book that was like largely engaged in analyzing what storytelling looked like in 12-step fellowship. I wanted to say, I actually don't think this is what the entire conversation about recovery should be about. But I also think, in terms of the kinds of tyranny that can come about in recovery, one of the things that I find powerful, at least about a fellowship that involves many, many people, is that there are sort of as many approaches as there are people in the room. And so I think that there's, things can get dogmatic sometimes, but there are also, if there are 80 minds in a room, there are 80 different perspectives on what's being said. And so I think there's a kind of an essential pluralizing element in that. A couple of people have asked me in the past few months as I've been talking about this book, whether I think about the kind of compulsions behind addiction and the compulsions behind creation as like two different sides of the same coin. And to me, I think, I think compulsive people might be drawn to compulsively use and compulsively create. And obviously many of the figures in this book are probably examples of that. But I also think there was one of the clinicians I talked to in researching this book, described addiction as a limiting of repertoire, which I found to be a really provocative and memorable phrase. And that idea of limiting, of kind of addiction as something that constricts the horizon of what your life feels like, was really resonant to me. And that I when thinking about, okay, can writing or creation be compulsive as well? I wanted to say, to me, often writing feels like the opposite of that constriction, the opposite of that limiting of repertoire. It feels actually expansive and like it can kind of open out into the whole field. And so in that sense, not all compulsions are created equal. And I think not all tyrannies are created equal as well.
Absolutely. The one tyranny of addiction kind of leads you to hate that tyrant. And the other kind you'll grow to love eventually, because it opens you to freedom. Well, thank you. And I think we can open it up for questions from the audience now. And come up to the microphones.
Hello. Thank you for your honesty and courage. I look forward to reading your book. Could you, if you feel comfortable, could you talk a little bit about your family of origin's response to your journey and that story?
Oh, I won't put anybody on the spot. Some of my family of origin are here with us tonight, so we could ask them directly. But
okay, I withdraw the question.
My family has been incredibly supportive of this book, and they had the chance to read it before it came out, and I think for me, my family shows up a little bit in these pages, not very extensively, but I've always felt like a kind of a relationship to self-awareness and self-interrogation and an ability to question the world and question ourselves has always been part of what our family dynamic was like. And so in that sense, I feel like the projects of self-interrogation and asking questions of the world and thinking about, okay, what's my role in relation to the world? The moment that Jamie was pointing to, where I'm sort of looking at the fact that as an upper middle class white woman, I've been allowed to think about my addiction in terms of interior complexity and psychic suffering, and that luxury is not granted to everyone. That kind of thinking about, okay, what's my position in this larger context and what am I kind of accountable for is absolutely something that I think that kind of questioning happened all the time in my family. And I feel like it was one of my inheritances. So I feel grateful for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll go side to side. Is that right?
Oh, okay.
Hi.
I'm really grateful to, can everybody hear me? I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation happening in a public space rather than hiding behind the anonymity of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm really in my first stages of recovery, 9 months sober, and it resonated with me what you were talking about, dreams of drinking and dreams of lying about drinking. And my dreams lately have been plagued with those very similar dreams. And I was wondering if you could shed some light of maybe hope that that will change, or maybe a reality check that that's just part of the sober journey. And also congratulations on motherhood.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think wise man once told me that things don't always get better, but they always get different. And that's something that I really held on to. And so I think in terms of your dream life, my dream life, anybody's dream life, and the ways in which it kind of reflects our obsessions and preoccupations and the things we're kind of wrestling with, it's I didn't necessarily have a kind of a clean, unfettered arc in terms of what my obsession with booze looked like. I think one of the things that was very frustrating to me about early sobriety was that I wanted to give up drinking so that I wouldn't be obsessed with thinking about drinking all the time. And that when I stopped drinking, I was actually still obsessed with thinking about drinking all the time. I just didn't get to drink anymore. And that felt really unfair. And like that had been the whole point. And, but it really just took some time. And I think, again, it's part of what I was saying earlier about one of the virtues of there being 80 people in a room is that there are 80 different experiences. Like some people have the experience of being kind of liberated from obsession right away. And for other people, it, takes 5 months, 5 years, 10 years. I think it's really hopeful to hear all of those because it's like, okay, there are many, many different paths this can take, but just because it hasn't taken the immediate liberation from obsession path doesn't mean that liberation isn't going to happen. And so I would say, I can't make any promises about what it'll feel like, but I do really believe that no matter what, things keep evolving. Like, I don't think anybody's ever stayed in the same state of mind or heart or being kind of in perpetuity. So, yeah, congratulations.
So
yeah.
Hey, Leslie.
Hey, Adam.
Just the thing that is amazing is the impact this is going to have on people. And I just want to note before I ask the question that you could hear a pin drop while you were here and just watching people's faces. So this is already just on the people here having an amazing effect. But the question I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned, addiction, alcoholism in particular as a illness and the stigma, and some people refer to it as a disease. But either as an illness or a disease, it's kind of unique in that the mantra is the person has to take responsibility for their drinking as well as their sobriety. But my question to you is, for those of us who have rescue fantasies but don't want to be enablers in the talk, is there a role for other people in helping the person with an addiction? That's the question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, not to embarrass anyone, but I do want to say, so Adam Kaplan was one of the clinicians that I talked to in writing this book, and you can hear more of his wise words in its pages. So thank you.
I'm not a stalker, by the way, just but thank you.
Yeah. It's a hard and good question. Yes, absolutely. I think there's a role, and it makes me think a little bit about what you were talking about, Jamie, about like showing up for people you love who are inside of addictions and how much that asks. And
Al-Anon has a thing, what I learned going through it is helping yourself actually helps the addict, because really you become addicted to their addiction and to helping them. And that's the worst thing you can do. It seems so counterintuitive that you want to jump in and rescue, but actually you have to go through the 12 steps yourself.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that I was going to say was along those lines in terms of like taking care of yourself in the role of being a caretaker, and kind of not to forget that dimension, because I think there can be something in, it's like you can commit to a set of actions, like these are the ways I'm going to try to support this person and show up for this person and help this person find access to treatment, help give this person that kind of like support and buffering that might be useful to them, and like getting sober, staying sober. But I would say two things. It's like, one, never forget to kind of like take care of yourself inside that process, because it is incredibly demanding. And two, it's like you can commit to the actions, but you have no guarantee on what their results are going to be. And I think that's a a deceptively simple frame of mind to kind of be committed to actions, but try to completely uncouple yourself from any guarantees about what their results will be. And it's something that actually, I think anyone in recovery experiences as well, because you get really committed to other people's recoveries as well as your own. And I certainly have nourished plenty of rescue fantasies that, again, I think are kind of about my ego as a storyteller, right? Like I want to tell a story in which my actions save this person, or my actions are an important part of this person's sobriety. And, at a certain point I had to say, like, look, I can commit to being there for other people in a set of ways, but that doesn't promise me anything in return, because their lives are kind of ultimately outside of my control. And
Thanks so much.
Hey.
Hi, Leslie.
How are you doing?
Thanks so much for being so brave to bring another beautiful person into this world. That's really terrific. I read the New York Times piece, but I haven't read the book yet. But what can your book about recovery say to all the vast number of people who never recover? I mean, the vast majority of people aren't going to get better. So what can you say to those people?
Yeah, I mean, I think so one of the reasons, it might be a little roundabout, but this is an answer to the question. One of the reasons that I was really drawn to the idea of including multiple stories in this book and not just my own was not only this hope or this desire to write a book that could kind of structurally enact the kind of like outward vision of recovery by looking out at other lives, but also because I wanted to show a number of different addiction trajectories. Like I didn't just want to show a story about somebody who recovered in an ongoing way. I wanted to show stories about people who relapsed and never fully got sober, or people who never even tried to get sober. Like all of those stories are in this book as well. So Jean Reese is somebody who kept drinking pretty much until the day she died. She lived an impossibly long time for how much she drank, but she was a sort of like an unredeemed drunk in that way. Berryman struggled continually with relapse and committed suicide after relapsing after his longest period of sobriety. And so there are plenty of stories in this book that aren't really successful recovery stories. And it's not necessarily that that I would offer those stories as where somebody is headed if they're inside of addiction, but that I wanted to show those lives as well as full of tremendous humanity and beauty. So Jean Reese created incredible works of art from inside her years of drinking, and Berryman made so much and struggled so much, and like in this deeply moving way wanted so much to get better and to be there for his children, his wife, and so even though his recovery wasn't kind of unbroken, there was a great deal of effort there and genuine desire there. And so I think this is very purposefully not just a book in which we see the kind of like standard issue recovery stories. It's also about how much humanity is in those stories that kind of don't follow that path.
Hi.
Hi.
I was so excited to hear about this book because for me, my creative life really began as a writer and a musician when I got into recovery. And I'm really excited because I try to look at other people who I respect. I know John Cheever wrote Falconer, and I mean, there have been some wonderful creations in recovery, but how would you say, this is sort of a big question, what are the ways, the qualities that you feel how has your writing been enhanced by looking at the world differently?
Yeah. So there's like a more noble way to answer that question and a more pragmatic way to answer that question. And one thing I would say is that it's easier for me to wake up and write when I'm not like tremendously hungover, for example. So I think there's like a kind of a simple way in which it helps. And I just remember like, I can remember in the last couple years that I was drinking, just waking up so many mornings and feeling, either just like foggy. I mean, I probably don't need to describe the what a hangover feels like to most of this room, but that kind of feeling of like your head plugged, and also even more distracting for me was like that I was often trying to kind of sort out some sort of mess, like, write another apology note to my partner and figure out how I was going to like kind of make it right from what I'd said the night before. And all of that was just, it was a kind of clutter. There was a kind of emotional clutter, and my clutter wasn't nearly as bad as the clutter that a lot of people deal with inside of active addiction. So it became a lot easier to create when I wasn't sort of trying to clean up messes on a daily basis. But I also, for me personally, one of the ways that my writing changed quite a bit in sobriety was that I became much more engaged with other people's stories. So I started to do a lot more reported work and a lot more interviewing. And that was both inspired by recovery and inspired by kind of like how transformative and sort of expansive it can feel to see a bunch of strangers who just look like the people you'd see on the street, right? And then they open up, and you see that inside each one of those strangers is like an infinity. And you might tell yourself that in the abstract, every single person I see on the street has an infinity inside of them. But it's another thing to see it kind of really play out. And then the other was more about capacity. Like I'm actually for much of my life, I really identified as like a very shy person. And so that the kind of being in communities where we were all doing a lot of kind of holding each other's difficulty and holding each other's stories, kind of opened me up a little bit to thinking about what role might those encounters have in my writing life, and what role might kind of seeking out the stories of others play in writing. So I think sobriety kind of informs creativity in all kinds of ways, and that's really one of the primary explorations of the book, but that's some of how it's kind of played out in my own life.
Thank you.
She also talks in her book about the drunk writers who got sober and wrote better.
Yeah.
Like Denis Johnson was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also that encouragement as well offered to writers.
We have time for one last question.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about your motivation for writing the book. So I was an acquisitions editor for 30 years, and I know from personal experience that if you want to grow an addiction, publishing is a great place to do it. But when I think about the authors I worked with, sometimes authors would say it was in me and I needed to get it out, period. But I also recognize in your story that the possibilities that this could be 12-step work for you. You're hoping that this story, helps others, or is it part of some catharsis or part of your journey to put this story out there the way you did?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think I am not always an expert on my own motivations, even though you sort of expect that people know why they do things. But I very much my motivations were I think the most important one was this hope that I could write something that might mean something to readers in the same way that other accounts of addiction had meant something to me. So, the experience I alluded to earlier of picking up Carolyn Knapp's Drinking a Love Story in a bookstore and, just sitting on the carpet and reading it cover to cover and feeling so spoken to by that book. I tell that story now as a writer, and I think, God, I'm also admitting that I never bought the book, but I did love it, and
we have copies here.
Good. But that sense of just knowing how much, not just addiction stories, but knowing how much narratives had meant to me as a reader, and thinking, God, if I could do some version of that for some reader out there, that would be a tremendous way to be useful. And I don't say that there are all kinds of also ego and self-expression motivations that come into play when I write, and I'm not about denying all of those, but that idea of speaking to somebody in the midst of a difficult reckoning in their lives and hopefully offering some kind of perspective on it. But then there was also a real aesthetic challenge that was compelling to me with this particular book of figuring out how to structure a book that could hold so many stories all together. And, the kind of, a lot of the writing that I had done before this book was invested in a certain kind of hybrid approach, like bringing together personal narrative and criticism and reportage, but I'd always done it in the form of an essay, and figuring out how to braid things together for 20 pages is pretty different, as it turns out, from trying to braid them together for 450 pages. And so the kind of craftsman in me and the always wanting to set that aesthetic challenge like a little bit harder or a little bit more complicated. I think that part of me really came out in trying to figure out how to make the structure of this book manifest the kind of intentions that I had for how it was going to create this sort of chorus.
Thanks.
Can I read this last section where you kind of lay out this beautiful thing about you and the prisoner not being different as a conclusion?
Sure.
I think this is the crux of Leslie's book, and why, to answer your question of like how she came or what you're trying to hope to accomplish. She talks about a woman who was imprisoned. Mostly, she was a meth addict, right? And she died in a desert in the cage, just neglected. She says, it's easy to forget that prisoner 109416 and I are the part of the same story, because we've been granted the right to tell very different tales about our pain. According to the scripts of our culture, one of us is a victim, the other a prisoner. But keeping our stories apart, understanding them as unrelated, would ratify the logic that let our fates diverge in the first place. The desert cage, the basement chorus. Our stories are both stories about coming to depend on a substance, to crave it, seek it, use it. And I no longer want to live by the traditions that kept them apart. So good. I think that's an amazing way to conclude. Thank you.